on the West Coast. That situation at the U.S. airports will continue at least until noon tomorrow, and then a reassessment will be made at that point whether to begin reopening U.S. airlanes, but no word yet on whether that may happen or not. Simply that it's a ground until noon tomorrow to all commercial flights, domestic and international. Tom?
All right, thanks very much. NBC's Robert Hager. Speaking of flights and people who are expected, Colin Powell is expected to land in Miami, Florida shortly. He was en route to Peru when he was turned around. The Secretary of State, it's not known if he will remain there or continue elsewhere. The President, as we have just been reporting, is in Omaha. The Vice President Dick Cheney in a secure but undisclosed location. Don Rumsfeld also working in a secure location. He was in the Pentagon when it was hit by that plane and rushed to the scene to assist with some of the rescue efforts that were being made. And then as this story began to unfold and people began to have an appreciation of the gravity and the magnitude of it beyond the first attack, then some extraordinary steps were being taken to make sure that the highest officials in the land were in secure places. No doubt that that was going on in financial institutions as well, especially given the location of the World Trade Center. And that has been going on around the world in most of the democracies. Certainly it's been true in Western Europe. Martin Fletcher is in Tel Aviv. On the West Bank, Palestinians were celebrating today, even though there was a strong statement from Yasser Arafat condemning this attack. What is the situation there now, Martin?
Well, yeah, some Palestinians were celebrating, about 3,000 in the West Bank town of Nablus, a few dozen in East Jerusalem, also in other West Bank towns, Kalkilia, Bethlehem, Tulkarm. They were celebrating until Palestinian police stopped it. They were throwing sweets in the air, giving out cakes. Basically, the attitude is that the United States, because of its firm support for Israel in the conflict with the Palestinians, their feeling is, well, America had it coming. But I should point out very strongly that the Palestinian leadership declared itself immediately shocked. Yasser Arafat called the attacks today in the United States unbelievable. But there is strong feeling in the street among some Palestinians that America did have it coming.
All right, Martin Fletcher, what has been the reaction from the Israeli government?
Well, very little. They said they don't want to say anything until they know exactly what happened. Of course, shock at what happened, shock at the killings. But there's a great sense that that when it's found out who did this, that there may be a very strong Middle East connection, of course, and Israel, seen as the strong ally of the United States, there's a sense that they don't want to exacerbate things at the moment by making it appear that this could have been a result of the American connection with Israel. So they're keeping quiet for the time being. Tremendous sympathy and shock, of course. But there's a sense that this story still has a long way to go. There could be more terror attacks. Israel itself on a very high state of alert today. The army put on what they call a high alert. They banned international flights from flying into Israel for at least 24 hours. People in big, tall buildings in Tel Aviv have been evacuated. They've turned the lights out. A great sense that this may not be the end of the story by a long way.
Yeah, Martin, let's talk about that for just a moment. It has been a very volatile situation in Israel. A lot of people there have believed that war was inevitable between the PLO and the Israelis once again, if not to say other Arab states. But this is only going to escalate that kind of an attack or that kind of prospect, because in recent days, more moderate Arab states have also condemned the United States for not taking a more active role in resolving this rising level of violence between the Israelis and the PLO.
That's right. Even Egypt today, I believe, said that that America should examine its position, its policies in the region. The leader of Hamas, which is the Islamic militant group that sends most of the suicide bombers against Israeli targets in the last few months, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, he said America has to change its policies, that the people of the region are very angry with the United States. And there is a sense, and also, by the way, also among the Palestinian media in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in the last few weeks, there's been an upsurge of articles against the United States, some even calling for attacks against American targets. So America very much identified with Israel and the problems in the region. A great danger that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is spiraling, I don't want to say out of control because it already seems out of control, but that things could get a lot worse and that other neighboring countries could get pulled in. There's warnings from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon that they're going to start attacks across the Lebanese border against Israel. A very, very dangerous situation here, a powder keg. And what happened in the United States today, many here are seeing as a reflection of the troubles in this region. If indeed it turns out there is a Mideast connection, we don't yet know, of course, who did these terrible things in the United States, but a strong fear here that the Mideast connection is a very real one.
Thank you very much, NBC's Martin Fletcher, as we continue to look with a sense of disbelief at the magnitude of the destruction in Lower Manhattan, the physical destruction. To repeat, as we have throughout the day, we still don't know how many people remain trapped in the rubble, what the exact numbers are. But as you look at that scene, I'll leave it to you to determine in your own mind just how widespread the human loss will be in New York City alone. That's the situation in Lower Manhattan right now. Here's a scene that is unusual in New York, people going home. They were leaving the borough of Manhattan for Brooklyn and other boroughs by going across. I'm told that that's the Manhattan Bridge. It's in lower New York City, and it leads out of the city, and a lot of people went home. This city, the most vital places in the world, obviously, has been all but shut down today. Hospitals working overtime, traffic in Midtown, and many of the high-rises have been evacuated. As we say, these flights that were originating both in Boston and Newark and in Washington, D.C., no doubt did have some prominent people on board. We're beginning to get some sense of who some of the passengers may have been, but there's been no official release yet of the names of them. American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles, 92 people on board. Flight 77 from Dulles to LA, 62 on board. Flight 175, Boston to Los Angeles, 65 on board, and Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco, 45 on board. That was the flight that went down near Pittsburgh, the United and American flight that you see one on top of the other. Flight 111 and 175 went into the Twin Trade Towers, and Flight 77 is the one that we believe went into the Pentagon after a very low, swooping turn over Washington, D.C., on a day when the president was out of the Capitol and the Secretary of State was out of the Capitol, and people were anticipating some budget fights coming up in Congress. But America has changed today. This is a dark day in this country. It's in bold print in future history books about how America was attacked within its continental borders with devastating effect by terrorists in a coordinated assault using hijacked civilian airliners to do just that. I'm told that the president went into the underground bunkers called Stratcom on Offutt Air Force Base at 3:06 Eastern Time today. He will be meeting with the national security staff on a video teleconference. Offutt is south and just slightly east of Omaha. It's been a fixture there for a long, long time. And of course, it used to get a lot more attention during the Cold War because it was one of the places that B-52s would be launched for a counterattack, if necessary, against the Soviet Union. NBC's Campbell Brown outside the White House. Campbell?
Tom, we do have a little bit more information on what the president is doing right now. As you said earlier, he's at the Offutt Air Force Base. This is just outside of Omaha. This is, of course, the Strategic Command Center. And this information from the Pool reporter who is traveling with the president. They are allowing 5 members of the press corps to remain at least near the president in that area. And we have been told that he is participating, as you mentioned, in this National Security Council meeting by teleconference this afternoon. He's been in close contact with Vice President Cheney, and we have learned that the Vice President is in the White House. He's working out of the Operations Center in a secure area of the White House. We've also been told that the president has been in contact with his wife, that she is fine, but is also being held in a quote-unquote secure location, an undisclosed location. The president right now is traveling with a skeleton staff of close advisors. Press Secretary Ari Fleischer is with him, his advisor Karl Rove, Andy Card, who is Chief of Staff, and Dan Bartlett with him. Karen Hughes, counselor to the president, is expected to give a briefing here at the FBI headquarters to the White House press corps here in Washington. The president told reporters there that he is anxious to get back to Washington, but understands, given the circumstances and the security precautions that are necessary now, that he needs to be there where he is in a protected area. But again, this is a place where they have the most advanced communication systems, where he can be in close contact with his entire national security team. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Campbell Brown. In fact, that is the nerve center should this country go to war. Those are hardened bunkers deep in the ground. It was the original headquarters of Curtis LeMay, obviously, and Thomas Power, two of the legendary Air Force generals during the worst days of the Cold War, and it's out there in the Great Plains of the Midwest. Lee Hamilton, former senator from Indiana, joins us now. He is a widely recognized foreign policy and national security affairs expert. Mr. Hamilton, the political leadership in both parties, what should be the first moves once we get beyond the ability of get beyond this assignment that we have of rescuing all the people who are still trapped there and sorting out the physical damage?
I think a number of policy areas need to be reviewed and will be reviewed immediately. Everybody thinks first, of course, of intelligence. Our intelligence has been quite good, but massive failure today. There will be almost certainly heavy increases funding for intelligence. There'll be a lot of demands for more human intelligence. Secondly, I think there will be massive reviews of security, all kinds of state, local, federal installations and buildings. How can we improve the security? There'll be, third, a review of community responses. How effective are we in responding to these tragedies and how quickly? There will be foreign policy reviews, particularly with regard to the Middle East, in the likely event that that's the source of the terrorism. And there will certainly be a review of the priority of the threats that we confront as a nation. So I see this event as having very profound consequences in this country for years and years to come. And on policy, those changes will begin very soon.
I know that you have been one of those many people in Washington who have been concerned about the possibility of a terrorist attack, and we have been saying this throughout the day, but I think it does bear worth repeating. No contingency plan that I ever saw or even heard about, for that matter, prepared this country for an attack of this nature, so complex, so sophisticated, and carried out with such cold-blooded efficiency.
That's true, but also predictable. I think most every expert that I know on terrorism has said, as indeed some of the reports have said, that the American people are not as secure as they think they are in their homes and in their workplaces, that eventually the terrorists, because of their increased skills, increased sophistication, and because of the vulnerabilities of our communities and of this country, because of its openness, that eventually they would make their mark, and they have. Now, I don't think any of us predicted this particular kind of an attack, but the fact that you had a massive terrorist attack on American installations and cities should not come as a surprise.
Unfortunately, I think that that's a commentary that rings all too true. Former Congressman Lee Hamilton, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It is a new day in America, a day of grieving and shock and anger, and a day of profound changes that are yet to come in what form we cannot say for sure. But obviously, this is not just an isolated incident in our lives. This is one that will be a marker in our history. And watching all of this from abroad is Alex Standish, who is with the Jane's Intelligence Digest, is one of the most highly regarded publications in the world in keeping track of just this kind of an incident. Mr. Standish, where were you and what did you think when you first heard that such a carefully coordinated and, I dare say, cold-blooded, efficient attack had been conducted against the United States?
Well, obviously, like all right-minded people, I was totally horrified, but I'm afraid I have to say not entirely surprised. As recently as Friday of last week, our publication specifically warned that anger in the Middle East directed towards the United States from the Islamic world was reaching crisis proportions. And we also specifically warned that there was an upsurge in terrorist activity in Lebanon, Afghanistan, and various other countries in the region, which were obviously being attended to by US intelligence. And so I think, as I say, we're horrified, but not surprised.
Why the United States has been trying to stay out of the Middle East. They've issued a couple of strong statements against rising Israeli violence, but it has not jumped in on the side of the Israelis, so to speak, in terms of this latest episode of exchanges between the PLO and Israel. Why do you think it came now?
Well, I think this has clearly been an operation which has been planned meticulously, possibly over months, even years. This is not something which has been put together overnight or even in the last couple of weeks. I think these individuals responsible for carrying out these appalling attacks are clearly people who have been in the United States for some time, or have been aided and abetted by those who have been in the country. They may well be what we would regard as sleeper agents. I think the timing is probably designed, as far as possible, at a time of renewed tension in the Middle East, to create really the conditions for derailing, possibly permanently, the peace process. But I think there is also an element in which recent pronouncements by President Bush, particularly his statement on the 24th of August, during which he called upon the Palestinians specifically to desist from terrorist activity, have certainly, I think, given the impression, even if that is not the case, that the United States was firmly in the pro-Israeli camp, as opposed to being an equal and honest broker within the peace process.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Standage, for being with us. We're going to go to Washington now. Our Washington Bureau Chief, NBC's Tim Russert. Tim?
Tom, it's extraordinary, the mood in Washington. As you know, the president is now out in Omaha, Strategic Command. People in Washington very much looking forward to hearing more from him. The fact that he has chosen to go there, a place which is the nerve center of all our military activity, is an indication that perhaps this threat has not ended. There was some thought that he may be coming back to Washington, and the fact that he has not underscores the concern that there still may be a continuing threat.
We've just been hearing from some of our people in the Middle East and other places saying it would be inappropriate to link this to the recent administration policies in the Middle East, Tim, because after all, as Mr. Standish just pointed out, this took a long time to plan this. This didn't happen in the last 6 weeks or so.
No, Tom, but there has been a steady stream of reports, very unsettling from the Middle East. The head of Saudi Arabia intelligence resigned without much explanation. There's reports of a near insurrection in Georgia. Egypt has been experiencing a lot of street activity. Clearly, tensions and anxieties and incitements have become almost the norm, not only on the West Bank, but throughout the Middle East. So clearly, people here in Washington believe there is a tie and are targeting the notion that this is a direct response to the tensions in the Middle East, or at least that ongoing conflict. The other thing I can report, Tom, is that investigators are looking very, very closely. I reported earlier to you that, one, all the flights were bound to California with a heavy fuel load. They also now note that all 4 flights were Boeing 757s and 767s. I am told that these have exactly the same flight deck, that if you can fly a 757, you can fly a 767. And they note that rather than go for an Airbus or a 737, all 4 hijackings exactly the same kind of aircraft, which leads them to believe that the terrorists were in fact, could very well have been pilots themselves who have been in this country for some time or trained to fly those planes after hijacking them, because they underscore how difficult it is to control a plane of that size directly into a target like the World Trade Center or the Pentagon.
All right, Tim Russert, as we continue to look at pictures at the hospitals here in New York City as they offload the various injured people, many of them suffering from smoke inhalation. A lot of them were not in the World Trade Center itself. They could have been in the perimeter of it. When it came down, there was an almost impenetrable wall of dust and smoke at that time. St. Vincent's and New York Hospital are both down in that area. New York has, as you might expect, both just across the line in New Jersey and in the other boroughs and in the city itself, a number of first-rate hospitals. CNBC's Ron Insana was down there, and he was caught in the midst of all of this as well. Now, when you look at that damage, Ron, you realize again how fortunate you were.
Absolutely, Tom. With the debris raining down, it was certainly a harrowing moment for many people in the lower reaches of Manhattan. And it, you know, as Tim Russert was suggesting, this attack clearly was designed to have maximum impact, not just in terms of the toll on human life or the political impact, but the economic impact as well. The World Trade Center is home to several Wall Street brokerage houses, to a few exchanges where gold and silver and things like that are traded. It is, in some ways, the financial nerve center of New York City. And we have to remember that at least 1/3 of all financial transactions in this country are routed through New York City. So it is very difficult at this time to assess what the economic damage is going to be to the country and to the systems that keep it running. Now, Federal Reserve officials and Securities and Exchange Commission officials say that they are in constant contact now to discuss their response to this, and one would assume also that the Federal Reserve, if required, would add what they call liquidity or money to the financial system in order to maintain something of an orderly economic environment. This comes at a time, of course, when the U.S. economy has slowed, where stock prices have come down in historic fashion, Tom, over the last 15 months. This is the type of event that will have rather severe economic consequences on top of everything we already know.
All right, thanks very much. CNBC's Ron Insana. I'm just reading one of the wire reports from the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. One of the passengers on board, we had heard this earlier, managed to get off a cell phone call to an emergency dispatcher saying that we're being hijacked. The plane went down about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. There's been some speculation that it might have been directed at another target of some kind as well, the Capitol or Camp David. We don't know, but it went down at that point. The man was in the bathroom. He had locked himself in the bathroom apparently at that time to say that they were being hijacked. There was an explosion, there was some smoke, and the plane went into a grassy field. All on board that United flight were killed, as you can see, just outside of Pittsburgh in Somerset County. It was that bizarre morning in which there were planes in the air, and some of the airlines didn't know what had happened to them. United, for a time, didn't know what had happened to that flight. In fact, we did know pretty quickly that the American airline flight 11 that went into the Twin Trade Towers first had started in Boston and then gone in there, and as we've been saying throughout the day, these were transcontinental flights and they had a heavy load of fuel, and they might have been picked for just that reason. And Tim Russert was pointing out that if you can fly a 757 or a 767, the flight decks are so similar, so these were probably trained pilots, because it's hard to imagine an American commercial airline pilot, even with a gun to his or her head, that would dive a plane into the Pentagon or into the Trade Center. And of course, what makes this kind of terrorism all the more difficult to deal with is there are so many people who are willing to die for their cause, as they were in this case. The hijackers went down with the plane, with the planes here in New York and also in Pennsylvania and again in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon, where it could have been so much worse. It also tells you about the liberties that we have in this country, that 4 airlines were hijacked today. They flew over the nation's capital. One report indicating that it banked right over the top of the White House before heading for the Pentagon. It was a flight that had taken off from Dulles Air Force Base. And then the flights here in New York, wrapping around the twin towers of the World Trade Center and crashing into them. So you may think that you're inconvenienced by airport security, or that you have been in the past. Think about what it's going to be like in the future and how reassuring it will be to you if it gets tightened up considerably, because it will have to be. Those are just one of the many changes that will occur. James Baker is former Secretary of State, former Secretary of the Treasury. He joins us now. He's on the telephone for us. Mr. Baker, this is a stunning and dark day for America.
It is indeed a stunning and dark day. It is a very tragic and sorrowful day, Tom, and I can't imagine acts that are more dastardly or cowardly than what has been done.
There has been a fair amount of discussion today about the United States' role in the Middle East, about how we are inseparable in the minds of the Palestinians and other Arab states with the Israelis. You spend a lot of time in that part of the world. Has it gotten worse, do you think, in the last 2 months?
Oh, I think that the circumstances on the ground in the Middle East have gotten significantly worse in the last 2 months. But then that's really pretty much, Tom, an axiom of Middle East policy, that when there's no progress at the diplomatic table, if there's no political progress, then there's going to be increased violence on the ground. But I must say to you, as bad as it is, I'm not at all sure that we should jump too fast to relate this to the absence of progress in the Middle East peace process over the course of the past 2 or 3 months, because we've had these types of we've had attempts in the past which have been rolled up that had nothing at all to do with the Middle East peace process.
And we continue to be the favorite target of especially Islamic extremists around the world, and whether or not it's related to the Middle East peace process.
That's correct. That's the point I'm making.
Where do we go from here? If you were sitting at the national security table tonight with the President of the United States, what would you be recommending? And I don't want to put you on the spot to try to make it more difficult than it already is for your friend, the President of the United States, but conceptually speaking.
There are not a lot of easy answers. The President, I think, did the right thing when he said America is under a terrorist attack, and we are going to hunt down and punish those we find responsible. And I think that's the approach that the American people want him to take. I do not happen personally to believe we're going to find that a nation was responsible for this. I think we're going to find that it was a terrorist cell or a terrorist group. I think some other things that we need to seriously consider, we actually considered them way back there in my day, is beefing up our human intelligence capabilities. We've let those disintegrate badly over the past 25 years because somehow we held the view in this country that we didn't engage in the dirty business of human intelligence, and it is a dirty business. But if we're going to preempt these types of attacks, we have to have better human intelligence capabilities.
But also dealing with some of those states that are not necessarily sympathetic to our points of view is going to be a very tricky piece of diplomacy in the coming months.
There's a lot of there may be equal parts here of force and strength and resolve on the one hand, and diplomacy and politics on the other. It is very important that we do whatever we can to advance peace in the Middle East. There's no doubt about that, and that of course helps the moderate Arab states that are friends of the United States that have a very difficult time. The leadership of those states have a very difficult time when events like this happen, because when these types of events happen, they harden the views of the rejectionists on all sides.
Mr. Baker, I'm going to presume on our long-time professional relationship and ask you to stay on the phone for a few moments, because we're about to go to the Pentagon, where we're going to get a briefing on what has been going on there. You are a veteran of so many of the American episodes in the Middle East, including, of course, the Persian Gulf War. It's worth pointing out that this briefing is going on outside the Pentagon building. So if I could just ask you to stay on the phone, let's listen to Admiral Quigley.
Okay.
Oh, I'm told it's not quite ready yet. Well, I just will point out that the Pentagon was evacuated earlier today after what Jim Miklashevsky had first reported was an explosion. Then we later learned that it was a United Airlines airliner that crashed into the building near the helipad and penetrated 2 of the 5 rings. There were an untold number of casualties there. We were told earlier by military officials that some people were killed and a number of them had been injured. This obviously is the locus of a lot of the decisions that are being made today. American military forces around the world were put on extra alert. Aircraft carriers were dispatched from the waters off Virginia north to New York City after the second plane went into the Twin Trade Towers. Don Rumsfeld came out of his office for a time and now is working in a more secure location. The President of the United States, who's the Commander-in-Chief, has been moved to Omaha, Nebraska, to Strategic Air Command headquarters, where they have the world's best communication equipment and hardened bunkers that go down several stories, and he can be in touch with parts of his government that are now in different places in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding environs. Secretary of State Colin Powell is en route back from Peru. That's the gaping hole in the Pentagon. That is a stunning sight when you look at it. That building could not be more secure if you're trying to make a personal entrance into it, and it is fortress-like if you have ever driven by it. And yet, when you direct an airliner into it, that's the kind of damage that can be done. Close to 100 people who were on board that plane were killed as well, obviously. Mr. Baker, let's talk a little bit about where we go from here in this country internally, how the president talks to America and how the political leadership, Republican and Democrat, begin to deal with each other after this attack.
Well, I think anytime you have a crisis such as this, it brings all Americans together, and it tends to bring all Americans together in support of their president, regardless of their party or their political affiliation. It happens in wartime, and it happens, I'm quite confident, in circumstances like this. So I think all Americans will be very supportive of the president and supportive of the administration as we work through these tragic events over the next few weeks. Let me just add, just as a matter of possible interest to you, it was a shocking experience for me today because I happened to be in my in my office in Washington, and I was listening to the reports of the planes going into the World Trade Center. And when that second one went in, or when I guess when the first one went in, it was pretty almost certain that it was a terrorist attack. And then I'm looking out my window, and it looks right out across the river, and I see this plume of smoke begin to rise from just about where the Pentagon is, and it's right. I'm looking out there at the very time that airplane goes into the Pentagon, and it was a shock, a real shock to see that.
Even after all you've been through and all that I've been through, certainly, there was a sense of disbelief at the beginning, wasn't there?
Absolutely, absolute disbelief. And if you remember, some of the early comments were to the effect that maybe some of the aircraft directional devices got off course or something. And yet here were planes in broad daylight in perfect weather flying right into the middle of those Twin Towers.
All right.
It was terrible.
Mr. Baker, we're going to ask you again to stand by. We're going to go to Karen Hughes now, who is speaking for the president.
The activities of the federal government in response to this morning's attacks on our country. As you heard from President Bush a short time ago, the federal government is acting to help local communities with search and rescue and emergency management operations, to take all appropriate precautions to protect our citizens, and to identify those responsible for these despicable attacks on the American people. While some federal buildings have been evacuated for security reasons and to protect our workers, your federal government continues to function effectively. We have a federal emergency response plan, and at President Bush's direction, we are implementing it. We began to implement it immediately after the first attack in New York this morning. We contacted American forces and embassies throughout the world and placed them on high alert. The United States Secret Service immediately secured the President, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House, and they are all safe. They have also secured members of the National Security Team, the President's Cabinet, and senior staff. As you know, President Bush was in Sarasota, Florida, when the first attack occurred this morning. Air Force One has now landed at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, and the President is in a secure location. He is in continuous communication with the Vice President and key members of his cabinet and national security team. Vice President Cheney and our National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, are in a secure facility at the White House. I have just come from there. The Secretary of Transportation and other members of our White House senior staff are gathered at a command center there, and we are coordinating with other branches of our federal government. The Secretary of Defense remains at the Pentagon, and the Secretary of State is en route back to Washington from his trip to South America. President Bush is conducting a meeting of the National Security Council as we speak. They are meeting President Bush from his location and other members from different locations in Washington and other locations. As many of you have been reporting, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all airports closed and all planes which were in the air were directed to land at the nearest airport. International flights were diverted to alternate locations outside of the United States. Transportation Secretary Mineta has directed the Federal Aviation Administration to suspend operations until at least noon tomorrow. So no airline flights will operate until at least then, and until the FAA announces that operations will be resumed. Secretary Mineta has also